Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Each week I answer film-related questions submitted from our patrons via our website. Simply go to the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and look for the Ask Andrew form. Send in your film-related question and maybe I'll answer it in an upcoming video. This week we just have one question because it's a bit of a doozy. Alan asks, I recognize and appreciate the importance of the auteur theory as a way to view films critically, yet it has a lot of limitations for me. There are some great American filmmakers who don't have a recognizable and recurring visual or thematic style like Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford, yet they have directed some great films. More specifically, I'm thinking of William Wyler. Wyler is never mentioned in the pantheon of auteurs, yet he directed some of my favorite classics, including The Letter, The Little Foxes, The Best Years of Our Lives, The Heiress, and more. Do you have any feelings about the auteur theory? Is it too limited in its approach to the study of film? Well, Alan, thanks for the question. You are right that the auteur theory is limited. It is, for one thing, just a theory, and for another thing, it's not intended to be a theory of everything. But before I talk about its strengths and limitations, let me explain a little bit about what it is. In the 1950s, in France, there were a number of film critics who worked for and published a film journal called Cahiers du Cinéma. And those critics were big fans of American movies. It's worth noting that those critics would go on to become quite successful filmmakers themselves, people with names like Jean-Luc Godard and Eric Rohmer and other members of the French New Wave, many of whom were members of the staff of Cahiers du Cinéma. But what happened is in France in the years following World War II, there became a number of Hollywood films available for the first time that hadn't been available during the war and immediately after for obvious reasons. And so there was sort of this glut, or a glut suggests something negative. I would say this trove of Hollywood movies that hadn't been seen in France that were sort of released in bulk or something resembling in bulk, as opposed to how they would have been spread out over years had the war not stopped American films from being shown there. So the French public, and certainly these critics at Cahiers du Cinéma, got to see a number of American films in relatively close succession in a way that we can do now, on a whim, but they certainly couldn't do in the 1950s. And when they did see a number of these movies by filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford, and to an extent Orson Welles, although he didn't make nearly as many as those other two, they started to notice certain patterns and consistencies and themes and styles that occurred across the films made by a given director. And they wrote an article about this, and they wrote many sort of essays about the filmmakers themselves, and the sort of ideas that came out of these writings came to be known as the auteur theory. And the general idea basically is just that when you look at the films made by a truly exceptional director, you can see across those movies certain consistencies of style, of aesthetic, of technique, but also of theme and ideology and worldview. And so the notion that the best directors, those that are a cut above all the other, even just good directors, have these elements of consistency across all of their films, was something that gained some traction first among these critics and in France more generally, but then it was brought to the United States in the early 1960s by a New York film critic, Andrew Sarris. He wrote a book about it, and in that book, he sort of went through American cinema from, I think, the late 20s to the early 60s and looked at the work of many, many, many directors and sort of categorized them into levels of quality based on the extent to which this auteur theory seemed to apply to them and their work or not. And that's sort of what Alan's referring to when he says pantheon, because Sarris picked, I think 14 or 15 directors that he put in this top category called the Pantheon. And it's true that he excluded a number of very good directors, particularly directors who were popular and critically acclaimed at the time he was writing, the early 1960s. One of them was William Wyler, but there were others that he sort of tended to dismiss, including Stanley Kubrick, and some others that I think most of us would today agree are truly exceptional filmmakers as well. And this is sort of where the theory runs into some problems, because while I think those of us who watch movies and think about them, sort of seriously and look at the works of a given filmmaker kind of as a group, we can certainly see consistencies of theme and style and other elements and choices across them. I don't think anyone could make a good argument that there aren't consistencies across the work of John Ford or Alfred Hitchcock or Martin Scorsese, or even to an extent Steven Spielberg. But the problem is that there are a number of wonderful filmmakers about whom you can't readily say that. Two that spring to mind are the Coen brothers and Billy Wilder. And beyond that, there are a number of truly outstanding films that can't be put into those categories either, because they weren't made by one of these so-called sort of pantheon filmmakers. So those are legitimate shortcomings with auteur theory. Other shortcomings, the biggest, I would say, is that auteur theory sort of depends on the notion that the director is the author of the film, right? Is the primary or defining artist behind the movie. But the problem with that is that we know that, depending on the movie, anywhere from dozens to hundreds to possibly even thousands of people work on a film. And some of those people are clearly only implementing specific, ideas or directives based on what the director says. But some of them work in a much more sort of style of collaboration or spirit of collaboration, like the cinematographer and the composer and the costume designer and the set designer. And so to say that, not to mention, by the way, the screenwriter who sort of gets the ball rolling, right? So auteur theory sort of says that those contributions, I won't go so far as to say it says they don't matter, but it says that they aren't, sort of formative in the creation of the film. And that's a problem. So there are fair and serious limitations to auteur theory. That being said, it has taken root. It took root among those critics who would become filmmakers at Kaiju Cinema. It took root and still has purchase in critical circles in American culture. And even those of us who might approach movies more casually, it still holds sway over us. Movies are constantly organized by director in a host of sort of, commercial or industrial or sort of common usage ways. And why is it that they are sort of organized or put forth by director far, far, far more than they are by producer or screenwriter or cinematographer, who arguably has at least as much to do with the look of the film as the director? So we, as moviegoers and film fans of many stripes, find that view that the director does have some sort of, enormous influence, or some would say outsized influence on the film. We do find that as a useful sort of notion. So I'm not willing to dismiss it out of hand. Its practicality, the way that it has taken hold in different levels of film culture, and the fact that for many filmmakers it is a helpful critical lens through which to view their work, leave me in the position of saying that auteur theory has its merits and its uses, but it is not a theory of everything related to film, and it is certainly not the only way to think about movies, and it is certainly not the only way to decide which movies are good and which directors are exceptional. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think it has some value, but you're right, Alan, it really does have its limitations. Thanks for the question. It's a really interesting topic. And thank you all for checking out this edition of Ask Andrew. Again, if you have a film-related question, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. Look for the Ask Andrew form and send it in. Maybe I'll answer it in an upcoming video. And if you like what we're doing at Bryn Mawr Film Institute while we're closed because of the pandemic, please consider making a donation. We'd certainly appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.